Have you ever stumbled upon a story so raw and powerful that it feels like stepping straight into someone's hidden life? This is one of those stories, a journey of betrayal, resilience, and a fight for dignity that will leave you speechless. To respect the privacy of those involved, I've changed their names and locations, but every emotion you're about to hear is real. So lean in, listen closely, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the latest stories. Hit the like button and leave a comment saying I'm listening so we can stay connected and share this journey together. It was a gray February afternoon in Springfield, Missouri. A cold drizzle tapped gently against the windows of the taxi as it rolled down West Pine Street. Inside, Martha Jenkins sat quietly, her hands folded over a small leather purse. At 68, the retired elementary school teacher looked tired but hopeful. She had just spent 2 months in Florida caring for her older sister after surgery and was longing for the comfort of her own little wooden house at 1427 West Pine Street, the place she had called home for over 3 decades. She pictured the smell of cedar, the old rocking chair by the window, and the familiar sound of the creaky floorboards greeting her like an old friend. The taxi stopped, and Martha stepped out into the chilly air. She pulled her coat tighter, balancing a worn-out suitcase in one hand and a grocery bag of homemade jam in the other, gifts she'd brought back for her son and his wife. Her heart fluttered with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Maybe Michael will be home early today, she murmured to herself. He always liked my strawberry jam. As she pushed open the front gate, something felt off. The garden she had tended so carefully, the neat rows of winter pansies and trimmed hedges, was now cluttered with plastic toys, a toppled tricycle, and a deflated kiddie pool. The porch smelled faintly of burnt pizza and cigarette smoke. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. Inside, the house she had built with her late husband's savings had transformed into a noisy daycare. The living room floor was a battlefield of Lego bricks, sticky juice boxes, and crumpled fast food wrappers. A television blared cartoons at full volume while 2 toddlers ran circles around the coffee table. The sofa where Martha used to sip her morning tea was now covered with laundry, and an open pizza box sat on her handmade quilt. Standing in the middle of this chaos was Samantha Brown, her 32-year-old daughter-in-law, in leggings and a bank ID badge still clipped to her sweater. She had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes sharp and cold. Without even a greeting, Samantha's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "Why is that old leech here? We don't have space." The words hit Martha harder than the winter wind outside. She froze in the doorway, her suitcase slipping slightly from her grasp. Old leech, she thought, her heart sinking. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was small and trembling. "Samantha, this is my home." Her words were drowned out by the TV and a toddler's scream. Samantha rolled her eyes and turned back toward the kitchen, muttering under her breath about no privacy and constant interruptions. Martha stood rooted to the spot, blinking back tears. She could still see the pencil marks on the doorframe where she had measured Michael's height as a boy. This was supposed to be her sanctuary, a place of warmth after a lifetime of teaching and sacrifice. Now, with her son absent and his wife glaring, she felt like a stranger in her own house. Martha gripped the handle of her suitcase a little tighter, the skin on her knuckles turning white. She could feel her heart thudding against her ribs as she took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to steady herself. The noise of cartoons, clattering dishes, and children's laughter swirled around her like a storm. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft but steady, the same voice she had once used to calm an entire classroom of restless third graders. I just want to go to my room and rest," she said quietly, almost pleading. Samantha let out a short, mocking laugh and flicked a crumb off her sleeve. She leaned against the kitchen doorway, her posture dripping with casual defiance. "Your room?" she sneered. "That's the kids' room now. You can see that, can't you? Michael already said it's fine." The words sliced through Martha like a blade. She turned her head toward the hallway and saw her bedroom door wide open. Inside, the neatly folded quilts she had stitched by hand were now heaped in a corner, bright superhero sheets covered her bed. Crayon drawings were taped over her framed photographs. A toy fire truck lay abandoned on her nightstand, next to the lamp she had bought the week her husband died. Her eyes welled up, but she blinked hard. "Stay calm," she told herself. "Just breathe." Two little boys, identical twins with tousled brown hair, ran circles around her legs, giggling as they swung plastic swords. Their sticky hands brushed against her coat. "Watch out, lady," one of them shouted before dashing off toward the living room. Martha forced a thin smile. "They're just children," she thought. "They don't know." From the kitchen came the clatter of pans. A woman with salt and pepper hair tied back in a loose bun stood stirring a pot of soup on the stove. She was shorter than Samantha, her face lined from years of work, but her eyes were sharp. Linda Brown, Samantha's mother. Martha recognized her from the wedding but had never seen her in her home before. Linda glanced up briefly, her tone light but edged with something colder. "Back so soon?" she asked. "Wasn't Florida more fun?" Martha swallowed hard. It was one thing to see strangers' belongings in her house, but quite another to find her daughter-in-law's entire family installed like they owned the place. She looked around again, a pair of men's work boots by the door, a woman's handbag on her piano, and a stack of folded laundry she didn't recognize. Her stomach turned. Before she could speak, a door creaked open from the garage. Michael stepped into the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag. Her son, 35, still with the boyish face she remembered, but now his shoulders were hunched, his eyes darting anywhere but at her. "Michael," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. What is happening here?" He avoided her gaze, fidgeting with the rag. "Mom." "I'll explain later," he muttered, almost under his breath. Martha felt a lump rise in her throat. She had crossed the country to come home, bringing gifts and expecting warmth. Instead, she was being treated like an intruder. She took a step toward him, her voice breaking. "What are you all doing with my house?" Silence fell over the room for a brief moment. Even the twins slowed their play to look up at the adults. Martha stood there, her suitcase still at her feet, staring at her son as if he were a stranger. The weight of betrayal, confusion, and grief pressed down on her chest. She had never felt so out of place in her own home. Martha stood in the middle of the living room, clutching the strap of her handbag as if it were a lifeline. The smell of reheated pizza and detergent mixed with the faint cedar scent still clinging to the old wooden beams. Outside the window, the tall maple tree she had planted with her late husband 30 years ago swayed gently in the February breeze, its branches whispering like an old friend trying to comfort her. Samantha, meanwhile, leaned against the doorframe with a coffee mug in hand, her face expressionless. She took a slow sip, then set the mug down with a sharp clink on the counter. Her voice came out cold and deliberate, each word like a verdict. "You should understand by now, Martha. You're old. You're alone. This house was sitting empty. We're using it to raise our kids. That's more reasonable, don't you think?" Martha felt her stomach knot. She drew in a shaky breath, her eyes darting around the room she had scrubbed on her knees after Michael's first birthday, the room where her husband had built the fireplace mantel by hand. All those memories now buried under toys and takeout boxes. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling but still carrying a trace of dignity. "This house," she said slowly, "this house is still in my name." Michael shifted uncomfortably near the kitchen table, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He stared at the floor as if the scuffed linoleum had suddenly become fascinating. Martha searched his face for some sign of support, but he wouldn't look up. Samantha shrugged, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Michael's already handled the paperwork," she said matter-of-factly. "After all, someday it will belong to us anyway. Why wait? You don't have to worry about it." The words hit Martha like a slap. She felt the blood drain from her face. "Paperwork? What paperwork?" She glanced at her son again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael, is that true?" He flinched but didn't answer. Outside the window, the maple tree's branches rustled louder, almost as if the tree itself were protesting. In her mind, Martha saw herself kneeling in that same yard decades ago, planting the sapling with dirt-stained hands while her husband, still alive then, stood behind her with a smile. It had been their promise of a future of roots and stability. Now that same tree stood as a witness to her displacement. Her heart pounded painfully. Every word Samantha spoke seemed to slice away at the life she had built, the quiet evenings after long teaching days, the summers spent sanding the porch, the winters she survived alone after her husband's accident at the mine. This house had been her fortress, her castle against the storms of life. And now, standing in her own living room, she felt like a trespasser. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling on the strap of her handbag. "You're not just using my house," she said, her voice breaking, "you're tearing down everything it stands for." Samantha rolled her eyes and turned back toward the kitchen, muttering something about old people being dramatic. Michael remained silent, his shoulders hunched, his eyes glued to the floor. For the first time in her life, Martha felt the ground shift beneath her, not literally, but in the quiet, devastating way of realizing that the people you love have redrawn the lines of loyalty without telling you. What had once been her sanctuary had turned into a psychological battlefield. Her fortress had been breached from within, and the enemy was not a stranger but her own family. The taxi engine hummed softly as it rolled down Glenstone Avenue toward a row of budget motels on the edge of Springfield. Rain streaked across the window in thin silver lines. Martha sat in the back seat with her hands clasped tightly on her lap, the leather of her worn handbag cool under her palms. Her suitcase sat beside her, a small mountain of faded fabric and scuffed corners, a lifetime compressed into one bag. She stared out at the blur of neon signs and convenience stores passing by, but her mind was far away, retracing a path back to 1993. She could see it as clearly as if it were happening right now, the smell of fresh lumber, the sound of hammers striking nails, the way the evening sun had glinted off the pale wood of the house she had just bought. Back then she had been 38, a widow, still teaching full-time at Lincoln Elementary and taking on extra tutoring in the evenings to pay the bills. She remembered walking into the bank with a folder of savings and a pounding heart. "It's not much," she had told the loan officer nervously, "but it's honest." The man had nodded kindly and handed her the paperwork for the mortgage on a little wooden house at 1427 West Pine Street, a house that was to be her refuge and her son's security. In her memory, Michael was 5 years old, skinny-legged and bright-eyed, with a cowlick of hair sticking straight up. He had been there on the very first weekend, holding a tiny paintbrush in his small hand while she painted the porch rails. "Mom, is this really our house?" he had asked, his voice full of wonder. "Yes, sweetheart," she had said, crouching down to his level. "This is our house. Yours and mine." Michael had grinned so wide his cheeks dimpled. "I'm going to tell everyone at school. This is my house and my mom's." She could still feel the warmth of that little boy's pride radiating through her. He had called her his hero, bragged about how strong his mom was, stronger than any superhero. Night after night she had come home from school, changed into jeans, and worked in the yard until dark. She planted roses along the porch, hydrangeas by the fence, and that maple tree in the front yard with her own hands. In winter she had patched leaks in the roof and sealed windows to save on heating. Every month she had scraped together an extra payment on the mortgage, teaching piano on Saturdays and tutoring reading on Sundays until the bank statement finally said paid in full. Now, in the back of the taxi, Martha's throat tightened. She blinked hard at the rain on the window, but the tears came anyway. The image of little Michael with paint on his fingers flickered and was replaced by the man in her living room today, standing silent while his wife called his mother an old leech. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "It's not just about a room," she whispered to herself. "It's about everything we built, everything I gave up." The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror but said nothing. Martha closed her eyes. It felt as if a lifetime of sacrifice, the tutoring, the extra hours, the sleepless nights, had been dismissed with a shrug. It wasn't just her home being taken from her, it was the bond she had believed unbreakable. And sitting in that taxi headed to a cheap motel, she realized with a cold, quiet clarity she hadn't just lost her room. She had lost the family she had worked her whole life to hold together. Back at the small motel, Martha sat on the edge of the bed, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. The floral bedspread was scratchy beneath her fingers. She had a paper cup of lukewarm tea in one hand and her phone in the other, scrolling back through old messages. Each vibration of the screen felt like another nail in the coffin of her trust. It hadn't always been this way. She could still remember the morning last autumn when she had been packing her suitcase to leave for Florida. Samantha had come by with a cheerful smile and a plate of homemade muffins. "Don't worry, Mom," she had said brightly. "We'll take care of the house for you while you're gone. Make sure the plants don't die, keep the dust off the shelves. You just focus on your sister." Martha had been touched then. "Thank you, dear," she had replied, placing her hand gently on Samantha's arm. "I knew I could count on you." She had locked the door behind her with a light heart, imagining her home safe in family hands. Now, months later, sitting on a creaky motel bed, she scrolled through a new message from Rosa, the woman who had cleaned for her once a week for nearly a decade. "Mrs. Jenkins," the text read. "I thought you should know, they moved all your things to the basement." Her heart thudded as she clicked on the attachment. A photo appeared on the screen. It was her bedroom, or what had been her bedroom. The handmade quilts she had sewn were stuffed into plastic bins. Her cedar chest was pushed into a corner, the lock broken. The old lamp she had bought with her first teaching paycheck now sat crooked on the floor. In place of her familiar furniture was a brand new crib, stacks of diapers, pastel-colored curtains with cartoon animals. Martha felt a cold sweat break out on her palms. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a takeover. She swiped to the next photo, her jewelry box tipped over, silver scattered carelessly on a shelf. The porcelain angel figurine Michael had given her at age 7 now sat beside a bottle of baby lotion. She whispered into the empty room, her voice cracking, "They planned this." Her mind replayed every small sign she had ignored, Samantha's offhand comments about the house going to waste, Michael's vague promises about using it wisely, the way mail had started being forwarded without her asking. She realized now those hadn't been coincidences. They had been rehearsals, softening her up for the main act. The betrayal stung more than the loss itself. It wasn't just that Samantha had changed, it was that Martha had believed her. She had handed over her keys, her trust, her sanctuary. The sweet daughter-in-law with muffins and polite smiles had been laying the groundwork for something much colder. Martha put the phone down on the bedspread and pressed both hands to her face. In her chest was a dull ache, not of anger, but of grief. She had thought she was leaving her home in loving hands. Instead, she had walked into a trap built with smiles and promises. She straightened slowly, her eyes moving toward the window where a neon motel sign flickered in the drizzle. Her voice was almost a whisper, but it carried a new edge of resolve. This wasn't an accident. This was a plan. And with that realization, something in her shifted. The shock began to harden into clarity. She wasn't just a victim, she was a woman who had survived far worse and built a life from nothing. This was a blow, but it wouldn't be the last word. That night, Martha lay awake in the dim motel room, the steady hum of the air conditioner her only companion. The floral curtains, faded from years of sunlight, barely swayed as a winter draft slipped through the window frame. She had a styrofoam cup of bitter motel coffee on the nightstand, its aroma sharp and acrid, but she drank it anyway, anything to keep her mind alert. On the small table by the window sat her leather-bound journal, worn soft at the edges from decades of use. She flipped it open, the pages faintly smelling of ink and old paper. With a slow, deliberate hand, she began to write. Her handwriting was neat, the kind that had earned compliments from her third-grade students for years. No screaming. No crying. Plan first. She paused, staring at the words until they blurred. Her hand trembled slightly, but her back stayed straight. "They think I'm just an old woman living off scraps," she whispered to the empty room. "They're about to find out who built those scraps into a home." She wrote again, firmer this time. "Remember patience. Teaching children for 40 years had taught her that patience wasn't weakness. It was power, quiet and unshakable. The same patience she had used to teach Michael to read when he was 5, to pay off the mortgage, to nurse her husband through his last illness. Martha closed her eyes and let memories rise like waves, sitting at the kitchen table balancing bills late at night, holding a feverish Michael against her chest, patching the roof in the middle of a rainstorm because she couldn't afford a handyman. Each memory was a stone in the fortress she had built for herself and her son. She took another sip of coffee, grimacing at the taste. Her chest ached most of all from Michael's silence earlier that day. Not Samantha's insults, those she could brush off, but her son's refusal to defend her. That silence had cut deeper than any words. But even that wound was starting to change shape inside her. Pain was giving way to resolve. She could feel it in her bones, the same stubborn strength that had carried her through decades of hardship. Her eyes, reflected in the dark motel window, looked back at her not with defeat but with a steely glint. She picked up her pen and wrote the next line with careful precision. Tomorrow, return for documents. Photograph everything. Find a lawyer. She underlined it twice. The plan formed in her mind like a map. She would gather evidence, secure her papers, consult legal aid. This was no longer a squabble between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. This was about survival, about the right to keep what she had bled for. Setting down her pen, Martha stood up and stretched her back, listening to the motel ice machine clatter down the hall. She pressed her hand flat against her chest and breathed deeply. For the first time all day, her tears stopped. She whispered into the stillness, a promise more than a statement. They think I'm finished. But I'm just getting started. The clock on the nightstand glowed 1:17 a.m. She capped her pen, closed the journal, and turned off the lamp. Tomorrow would be the beginning of a campaign, not of shouting or vengeance, but of methodical action. She slid under the thin motel blanket, her eyes still open, staring at the ceiling. Her anger was no longer wild. It was sharp, cold, and clear, the kind of anger that could move mountains. The next morning, the motel's thin curtains let in a sliver of cold sunlight. Martha rose early, dressed in her plain navy coat and sensible shoes, and packed a small canvas bag with nothing but her phone, a set of spare keys, and a USB drive she kept on her keyring. In the mirror she smoothed her graying hair back into a low bun and took a steadying breath. She had rehearsed her excuse all night. I'm just coming by to pick up my medication, she would say. Nothing more. Nothing less. By 8 a.m., she was walking up the familiar path to her own front door. The maple tree out front, the one she had planted with her husband decades ago, stood bare but defiant in the winter air. Its branches scratched faintly against the siding like warning fingers. Martha slid her key into the lock and stepped inside, the scent of baby powder and burnt toast hitting her all at once. Just act normal, she whispered to herself. The house was quieter than yesterday, but still alive with distant noise, cartoons murmuring in the living room, the thump of little feet upstairs. She moved quickly toward her old bedroom, keeping her bag close to her side. When she opened the door, her stomach dropped. The room she had cherished for 30 years had been ransacked. Drawers hung open like wounded mouths. The cedar wardrobe her husband had built was scarred where someone had forced the lock. The quilt she had stitched by hand was crumpled on the floor. Martha's eyes darted to the corner where she had kept her small tin box, the one with her insurance policies, her will, and the deed to the house. It was gone. In its place lay only a few stray papers. She crouched down, hands trembling, and rifled through them. Receipts, toy packaging, and then something that made her heart slam against her ribs. A photocopy of a power of attorney document with her name printed neatly at the top and her signature scrawled at the bottom. But it wasn't her signature. She knew every curve of her handwriting, she had been a teacher, after all. This was an imitation, a clumsy one, but enough to fool someone who wasn't looking closely. Her breath came in short gasps. They're trying to take everything, she murmured. She reached for her phone, snapped photo after photo of the document, the broken wardrobe, the empty shelves where her albums had been. Then she slipped a small USB stick from her pocket and copied a folder of household bills from the family computer in the corner, her fingers moving fast and precise. As she turned to leave, a scrap of paper caught her eye in the kitchen trash can. She pulled it out with 2 fingers. It was a handwritten note in Samantha's sharp, looping script. Sell house. Pay off credit card. Buy SUV. The words swam in front of her eyes. Her knees wobbled, and she gripped the counter to steady herself. This wasn't just a family misunderstanding. This was theft. Fraud. Just then she heard Samantha's voice from the kitchen doorway, sharp and impatient. "Don't let her touch any of the papers." Martha froze. The tone, not defensive, but commanding, confirmed everything. They were afraid of her seeing what they'd done. She tucked the note into her coat pocket and lifted her chin, walking slowly toward the door as if nothing were wrong. Inside, though, her heart pounded. Her hands itched to dial a lawyer. She no longer felt like a mother sneaking through her home, she felt like an investigator gathering evidence at a crime scene. Each photograph, each note, was another piece of proof. By the time she stepped out onto the porch, her face was calm, but inside she was shaking with a cold, clear fury. The battle had shifted. She was no longer wondering if. She was preparing for when. Martha sat in her car at the end of the block, engine idling more to keep the heater on than to get anywhere. Frost rimed the windshield and her breath fogged the glass when she exhaled. She had parked just out of sight and pretended to be fumbling with her scarf while her phone recorded in her coat pocket. Her hands were steady, but her heart felt like a trapped bird. Inside the house, through the front window, she could see Samantha pacing the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear. Martha thumbed the record button and inched closer, listening for the cadence of her daughter-in-law's voice as if it were a physical thing she could grip. Samantha's voice came crisp and efficient, like someone arranging a delivery. "Hi, Dr. Jeff? It's Sam Brown, Samantha Brown." "I need a favor," she said, then laughed a little too brightly. "Yes, it's urgent. Look, there's an elderly client, Mrs. Jenkins. Can you do a cognitive screening? We need something official." Martha's stomach dropped. The friendly tone was a veneer over something much colder. There was a pause, a rustling of paper, the faint clink of a coffee mug. "How much?" the doctor asked. Martha's breath hitched. $100, Samantha replied without hesitation. Cash. Just sign and date. He doesn't need to see her in person, he can sign it as a courtesy. Michael's worried about complications otherwise. The word worry was soft, but the implication was sharp. They were trying to manufacture consent. Martha felt cold all the way to her fingers. The recording in her pocket vibrated slightly against her chest. She pressed her hand flat against it and whispered under her breath, "Michael, why?" The name came out like a plea into the empty car. She had always believed paperwork was a thing of trust, signatures on school permission slips, mortgage papers, the little checks she'd mailed off month after month. To hear them talk about fabricating a medical certificate for $100 felt like the foundation of her life being sawed slowly away. Samantha went on, her voice smooth and economical. "We can say she's showing signs, forgetfulness, confusion. It's routine at her age. If it's on file, the lawyer says the transfer will go through faster." Martha imagined the phrase "on file" like a lock clicking shut. "Michael's scared of legal trouble otherwise," Samantha added, as if that excused everything. A car door slammed in the driveway. Martha tensed, ready to bolt, but she stayed still. The twins' laughter drifted by and then quieted. Inside, Samantha concluded the call. "All right, thanks, Jeff. We'll drop by with the cash." She hung up inside, then barked toward the hallway, "Kids, don't touch anything on Mom's desk." That command was the final confirmation Martha needed. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was coordinated. The voice she had loved first as a mother and then as a teacher, the voice that had soothed scraped knees and read bedtime stories, had turned on her. The realization landed with a bone-deep heaviness, but beneath it, something colder and clearer sparked evidence. She fumbled the recorder out of her pocket, thumbed play, and Samantha's words filled the car in stark, damning clarity. Martha listened to the conversation again, not as a helpless victim but as a witness collecting a chain of proof. Each phrase was a link. If they use the law to steal, she thought, fingers tightening around the phone, I will use the law to fight back. The idea was not born of anger alone, it was strategic. Years in classrooms had taught her how to gather facts, how to present a case so that others could see the truth. This was the same method: document, timestamp, witness. She drove away slowly, the recorder safely backed up to the cloud as soon as she reached the motel Wi-Fi. Her hands were no longer trembling with shock, they were steadier, focused. The web Samantha and Michael had woven, Cash, a complicit doctor, a forged procedure, had given Martha something she hadn't expected, a clear path to defense. She had the voice of the liar, the plan in black and white, and now, a reason to call a lawyer. That night, as she copied the file to a flash drive and labeled it evidence, her whispered vow took on a new weight. You thought I was helpless, she said to the ceiling of her motel room, the words more a promise than a threat. But you've just made the mistake of underestimating me. It was late Tuesday afternoon when Martha walked toward the little brick coffee shop on Jefferson Avenue. The Sunrise Cafe sign buzzed faintly, its yellow letters glowing against the gray sky. Inside, the scent of roasted beans and cinnamon rolls wrapped around her like a memory of easier days. She pushed the door open, the bell above it jingling softly, and stepped into the warmth. Michael was already there, sitting at a corner table by the window. He looked smaller somehow, hunched over his coffee with his phone lying face down next to the cup. The boy who once clutched her hand at the playground now looked like a man waiting for a verdict. Martha adjusted her scarf, smoothed her skirt, and crossed the room with measured steps. She set her handbag down carefully on the chair opposite him and sat. For a moment she simply looked at him, at the lines on his forehead she didn't remember, the way his jaw clenched when he noticed her. Michael, she said quietly, but firmly. I don't want excuses. I just want the truth. He swallowed hard, his hand circling the warm cup as if it could anchor him. His eyes flickered to hers, then away again, toward the window where traffic crawled by. Mom! He started, then stopped, his voice breaking. I've been drowning in debt. Samantha, she's been trying to help me. We thought maybe, he trailed off. You don't really need a big house anymore. We thought. Martha felt the sting of his words but didn't let it show. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small envelope. Inside were the photographs she had taken, the forged documents, the broken locks, the handwritten note about selling the house. She placed them one by one on the table, her fingers slow and deliberate. Then she set down the USB drive, the one holding the recording of Samantha's call. This, she said, her voice steady, is my truth. Now tell me yours. Michael's face went pale. He glanced at the photos, then at her, then back down. His fingers twitched around the coffee cup, and for a moment Martha thought he might drop it. Samantha said, he whispered, you were slipping. Forgetting things. That it would be safer to transfer the house early, before something bad happened. Martha's breath caught in her throat. The cafe around them hummed with quiet conversation and the hiss of steaming milk, but at their table it was utterly still. She leaned in, her eyes fixed on his. You believed her over me? She asked softly. Over your own mother? Michael's shoulders sagged. He pressed his palm over his eyes as if to hide. The boy who once called her my hero now sat before her trembling like a man caught in his own lies. A waitress walked by carrying a tray of muffins and glanced at them, sensing tension. The doorbell jingled again as someone left, but Martha barely noticed. Her heart felt heavy and hollow all at once. She had come for answers, and she had gotten them, but they weren't answers she wanted. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windowpane, and the smell of coffee turned bitter in Martha's nose. She reached out and gathered the photographs back into the envelope, sliding the USB on top. "I gave up everything to build that house for you," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. And now, she stood, her chair scraping softly against the tile. "Now I see what it's worth." Michael opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. Martha turned and walked toward the door, her steps steady. The bell jingled as she left, the cold air hitting her face like a baptism. Behind her, Michael stayed seated, his hands covering his face, the untouched coffee cooling between them. The door of the Sunrise Cafe swung open with a gust of cold March air. Martha turned just in time to see Samantha striding in, her high heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. She wore a fitted navy coat and sunglasses pushed up into her hair, as if she were arriving for a business deal rather than a family confrontation. Without asking, she dragged a chair back and sat down next to Michael, her purse landing on the table with a thud. "Don't make a scene, Martha," she said smoothly, lowering her voice but not enough to hide the edge. "You signed the papers already. Now you're just regretting it." Several heads at nearby tables lifted, the hiss of the espresso machine filled the silence. Martha's heart pounded, but she forced herself to breathe. She reached across the table, her fingers trembling slightly, and pulled the forged authorization copy from her bag, sliding it toward Samantha like a dealer revealing a losing hand. "I never signed anything," she said, her voice low but carrying. "And I am not suffering from dementia. You forged my name." Samantha gave a small, mocking laugh and leaned back, crossing her legs. "Oh, come on," she murmured, tilting her head. "You're nearly 70. How long do you think you're going to live in that big empty house? We're just trying to make it useful, to take care of things properly. Michael's under a lot of stress, you know." The words stung more than Martha expected. She had heard Samantha's cold tone before, but never so brazen, never in public. Around them, the cafe continued its soft rhythm, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of conversations, but at their table the air felt electric, crackling with years of resentment. Michael had been staring into his coffee, shoulders slumped. Now he looked up, his face pale. Something shifted in his eyes as he glanced from his mother's trembling hands to his wife's sharp smile. "That's enough, Sam," he snapped, his voice cutting through the room like glass. Several patrons turned to look. A barista paused mid-pour. Samantha's mouth dropped open slightly, as if she couldn't believe he had spoken back. "Michael," she began, but he shook his head, his hands clenching. Martha rose slowly, collecting her bag and the envelope of evidence. She straightened her shoulders the way she used to before walking into her classroom full of rowdy children, projecting calm even when she was trembling inside. "I'm done talking," she said, her voice steady, almost quiet. "You two will be hearing from my lawyer. This is no longer a family matter." Samantha smirked, but her fingers tightened on her purse strap. Michael said nothing, only watched as his mother stepped back from the table. Martha walked toward the door, her heels clicking on the tile. The bell above the door jingled brightly as she opened it, but the sound felt like the start of a storm rather than a farewell. Behind her, the cafe seemed to hold its breath. Samantha sat rigid, her face hardening, and Michael stared after his mother, a flicker of shame crossing his features. Outside, the wind whipped at Martha's coat as she stepped onto Jefferson Avenue. The sky had darkened with heavy clouds. She clutched her bag to her chest and breathed deeply. This was no longer about being a polite mother-in-law or a patient retired teacher. This was war, and she had just fired her first real shot. 2 days later, a pale winter sun was rising over downtown Springfield as Martha Jenkins stepped off the bus in front of the tall brick building that housed Coleman and Associates. Her fingers, stiff from the cold, clutched a worn leather satchel filled with photographs, photocopies, and a small USB drive. She paused at the glass doors, staring at her reflection, a retired teacher in a gray coat, hair pinned neatly back, eyes lined with sleepless nights. For a brief second she wondered if she had the strength for what lay ahead. Inside, the reception area smelled faintly of fresh coffee and paper. A young assistant greeted her kindly and led her down a hallway lined with certificates and framed newspaper clippings about elder rights cases. At the end of the corridor stood Rachel Coleman, a tall woman in her early 40s with sharp but sympathetic eyes and a firm handshake. She ushered Martha into a sunlit office, its walls covered with books and legal files stacked neatly in rows. "Mrs. Jenkins, please, have a seat," Rachel said warmly, pulling out a chair. "I've read your initial email, but I'd like to hear everything from you directly." Martha set the satchel on the table and began unpacking it, her hands trembling slightly. One by one she spread out the photographs she had taken, the stained nursery where her bedroom had been, the broken lock on her wooden cabinet, the photocopy of the authorization she had never signed, and the scribbled note about selling the house to buy an SUV. Rachel leaned forward, examining each item closely, her brow furrowing deeper with every new piece of evidence. She listened without interrupting as Martha described the forged documents, the phone call to the shady doctor, the insults about her age, and the betrayal of her only son. The more Martha spoke, the steadier her voice became. "You have more than enough here," Rachel said finally, tapping the stack of evidence with a manicured finger. "This isn't just a family squabble. It's trespassing, signature forgery, and elder exploitation. We're going to file a petition for emergency relief at Greene County Court and secure your property before they can do more damage." Martha swallowed hard, staring at the folder of documents. "I don't want my son to go to jail," she whispered. "Michael, he's still my boy. I just want my home back. I want this to stop." Rachel's tone softened. She folded her hands on the table and looked Martha directly in the eyes. "What you're asking for isn't revenge, Mrs. Jenkins," she said gently. "It's justice. Let the law take its course. Protecting yourself doesn't mean destroying your son. The court will decide the right measures. You've done your part by standing up." For the first time in weeks, Martha felt a weight lift slightly from her chest. She nodded slowly, her eyes damp but resolute. "All right," she murmured. "If this is the last fight of my life, then I'm ready." Rachel smiled faintly and slid a legal pad across the desk. "Sign here to authorize me to represent you. I'll file everything by the end of today. And Mrs. Jenkins," she added softly, "you're not alone anymore." As Martha left the office, the late morning sun poured through the tall windows of the lobby. She stepped onto the busy street with her satchel tucked under her arm, feeling a strange mixture of fear and determination. The sound of traffic and distant church bells filled her ears as she whispered under her breath, "This is my home. This is my battle. And I'm not going to lose." The words felt like an oath, steadying her steps as she disappeared into the crowd. It was early Monday morning on West Pine Street. A pale sun was only just spilling across the front porch of 1427 when a dark sedan from the Greene County Court pulled up quietly to the curb. The neighborhood was still sleepy, somewhere a dog barked and a lawn sprinkler hissed. In the kitchen of the old wooden house, Samantha Brown was slicing a loaf of bread for the twins' breakfast. The smell of toasted crust and jam hung in the air. Then came the knock, 3 sharp raps on the front door that sounded like a gavel hitting wood. Samantha frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and walked to the hallway. When she opened the door, a uniformed court officer stood there holding a clipboard and a thick envelope sealed with an official stamp. "Good morning, ma'am," the officer said politely. "Are you Samantha Brown?" "Yes, why?" she asked, a note of irritation in her voice. "I'm here to deliver an emergency eviction order issued by Greene County Court," he said, handing her the envelope. "This concerns unlawful occupation and property forgery. You're required to vacate the premises within 72 hours. For a heartbeat, Samantha just stared at the paper, her knuckles white against the envelope. In the kitchen, Linda Brown turned from the stove, a wooden spoon dripping oatmeal back into the pot. "What is it, dear?" Linda called, sensing the tension. The twins, still in their pajamas, were at the table coloring. They watched their mother's face change from confusion to rage. Samantha ripped open the envelope and scanned the first page. Bold letters at the top read, "Emergency Eviction Order." Her jaw tightened. She spun toward the kitchen. "Mother!" "It's from the court," she shouted, waving the paper like a flag. "They're throwing us out of the house." Linda's spoon clattered to the counter. The twins began to cry, their crayons rolling to the floor. At that moment Michael walked in from the garage, still wearing his work jacket. He saw the paper in Samantha's hands and froze. "Michael!" Samantha barked, her voice rising. "What is this? What do I tell the kids?" Michael stepped closer, taking the paper gently but his hands trembling. His eyes moved over the legal wording, his lips barely moving as he read. When he looked up, his face was pale, his mouth a thin line. It's a court order," he said quietly. "An eviction order. We're being removed." Samantha's eyes went wide. She crumpled the notice in her fist and hurled it to the floor. "That old woman dared to sue us?" she screamed. "She's actually dragging us to court?" Outside the gate, unnoticed until now, Martha stood by the sidewalk holding her coat closed against the wind. She had come not to gloat but to witness. Her heart ached at the sight of her grandchildren's frightened faces, but she stood tall, her chin lifted. This was the cost of justice. From her vantage point she saw Samantha pacing like a caged animal, Michael staring at the paper as if it were a verdict on his soul, Linda wringing her hands. The sound of the twins crying drifted out through the open door like a mournful echo. Martha felt tears sting her eyes, but she stayed still. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "The moment the old leech becomes the plaintiff." She didn't knock or step inside. Instead, she turned slowly and walked back toward the street, her footsteps measured, her shoulders squared. She could feel the weight of their stares from the window as she reached the sidewalk. She knew that this was not the end of the fight, only the first lightning strike of a coming storm, but it was the first time in months that she felt not powerless, but in control. Behind her, the house that had been her sanctuary now erupted in shouts. Inside, Samantha raged, Michael sat down heavily at the table, and Linda tried to calm the children. But the paper on the floor, stamped with the court seal, lay like a line drawn across the room. Martha walked away, whispering a small prayer under her breath, a mixture of sorrow and steel. She had not wanted it to come to this, but they had left her no choice. The house was hers again, and now the law was on her side. That afternoon, the sky over Springfield was heavy with gray clouds, the kind that hung low and muted the colors of the street. At exactly 3:15 p.m., a marked patrol car rolled to a stop in front of 1427 West Pine Street. Two more unmarked sedans followed quietly behind. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering, sensing something unusual was about to happen. Inside the house, Samantha Brown was pacing the living room with her phone in hand. Toys were scattered across the rug, cartoons flickered on the muted television. Linda Brown sat at the dining table, hands clasped tightly around a mug of cold tea. Michael Jenkins stood near the window, arms crossed, staring at the driveway. Then came the knock, 3 firm, official raps on the door. It made the twins look up from their coloring books. Samantha muttered, "Who is it now?" and stormed to the door, pulling it open. Standing there was Officer James Porter, a tall man in his late 40s with a calm but commanding presence, flanked by 2 colleagues in navy blue uniforms. He held a clipboard and a manila folder stamped with the seal of the Greene County Court. "Good afternoon," he said evenly. "We're here from Springfield Police Department in response to a court order. May we come in?" Samantha blinked. "Court order? What court order?" she demanded. Without raising his voice, James held up the document. "This is an order to investigate unlawful occupation and possible forgery concerning this property. We need to verify the ownership." Linda's face went pale. She whispered, "Sam," but Samantha cut her off. "This is my husband's house." Samantha snapped, blocking the doorway. "He gave me permission to be here. This is just a misunderstanding." James's eyes didn't waver. Then please provide proof of ownership, deed, mortgage, tax receipts, anything with your or your husband's name on it. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Samantha turned toward him, her voice rising. Michael, say something. Tell them this is ours. Michael's lips parted but no words came. He only glanced at the floor. James stepped inside, motioning gently to his partners. Ma'am, the name on the property records is still Martha Jenkins. Without legal documentation, you and your family are considered unauthorized occupants. We're here to ensure this process stays civil. Linda tugged lightly at Samantha's sleeve. Sam, maybe we should just. But Samantha whirled on her mother, her eyes flashing. No! We're not leaving. At that moment, the front door opened wider. Martha stepped in quietly, a folder in her arms. She looked tired but composed, her coat buttoned neatly, her hair pinned back. Without a word, she handed Officer Porter a small USB drive, a stack of photographs, and a sheaf of printed transcripts. This is everything I've documented, she said softly. Copies of the forged papers, the recordings, photos of the damage. James took the items, flipping through the photographs briefly before nodding. Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. This will help us forward the case to the district attorney. Samantha's voice cracked. She's lying. She's old and confused. James turned to her, his tone firm but not unkind. Ma'am, we'll let the prosecutor decide that. For now, you're required to comply with the court's order. Please gather your things. Michael sank onto the arm of the sofa, his hands covering his face. The twins had stopped coloring and were staring at the officers, wide-eyed. Linda began to gather her purse and whispered a quiet prayer under her breath. For the first time in weeks, Martha felt a small breath of relief. She stood a little straighter, her palms no longer trembling. The weight she had been carrying, of disbelief, of humiliation, of betrayal, lifted just slightly as Officer Porter spoke again. Mrs. Jenkins, he said, meeting her eyes, you've done the right thing. We'll handle it from here. You can be assured this will go to the prosecutor. Martha nodded, blinking back tears. Thank you, officer, she murmured. I just want my home back. As the officers began taking notes and issuing instructions, Martha stepped aside, looking around the room that had once been hers. The smell of crayons, spilled juice, and cooked bacon mixed in the air. It was still chaotic, still painful, but for the first time it felt like the tide was turning. Out on the street, more neighbors had gathered, murmuring about the scene unfolding. Inside, the line between right and wrong had been drawn at last, not by shouting, but by the quiet force of law. Martha exhaled slowly. She wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, under a pale November sky, 2 patrol cars pulled up once again to 1427 West Pine Street. Their flashing lights were off, but the quiet authority of their presence made the neighborhood still. Officer James Porter led the way, clipboard in hand, his boots crunching on the frosty lawn. Behind him walked Martha Jenkins, wrapped in her worn gray coat, clutching a small notebook. She had asked for this inspection, to finally see with her own eyes what had been done to her home. Inside, the air smelled faintly of baby powder mixed with stale coffee. The living room was a jumble of toys, unfolded laundry, and pizza boxes stacked like leaning towers on the coffee table. Samantha Brown stood near the hallway, arms crossed, her face carefully arranged into an expression of annoyance. Michael Jenkins hovered by the kitchen door, head down, thumb nervously flicking at his phone. James spoke clearly, his voice echoing in the cramped space. We're here to facilitate Mrs. Jenkins's access to her property. Please remain calm. He gestured to one of his colleagues, who began taking photos with a small camera. Martha took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her shoes made a soft sound on the wooden floorboard she had sanded herself decades ago. She went straight to the bedroom at the end of the hall. When she opened the door, her heart dropped. The room was unrecognizable. Clothes and plastic bins were piled against the wall. The curtains she had sewn were torn, the old cedar dresser pried open with splintered edges. Jewelry boxes lay empty on the bedspread. The quilt her mother had stitched was wadded up in a corner, stained with something unidentifiable. Her voice broke as she picked up a cracked jewelry box. This is my mother's box," she whispered, her hands trembling. "It was supposed to go to my granddaughter one day." Samantha appeared in the doorway, her tone falsely bright. "You're mistaken. We were just reorganizing things. The kids needed more space." Martha turned slowly to face her, tears welling in her eyes. "Reorganizing?" she said hoarsely. "You call breaking locks and emptying drawers reorganizing?" Michael shifted uneasily behind Samantha. "Mom, please." I'm sorry," he mumbled, eyes fixed on the carpet. Martha's gaze snapped to her son. Her voice rose, steady but sharp. "You forged my signature to take my house. My own son. How could you?" Samantha rolled her eyes, stepping between them. "Oh, stop with the dramatics. Nobody's forging anything. You're just confused." James lifted his pen, jotting down every word, his expression unreadable. Another officer snapped photographs of the dresser and the emptied drawers. The clicking of the camera felt like a gavel falling. Martha's shoulders shook, but she straightened her back. "I am not confused," she said, her voice clear now. "I taught children for 40 years. I handled my finances alone since my husband died. Don't you dare call me confused." Samantha's smirk faltered for the first time. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, glancing at the officers. Michael's face crumpled, but he said nothing. His silence was louder than any confession. James closed his notebook. "Ma'am, sir," he said to Samantha and Michael, "everything said here is being documented for the court. I advise you to answer truthfully." The room went quiet except for the faint whir of the camera and the muffled chatter of the twins playing in the next room. Martha stood in the wreckage of her bedroom, holding the empty jewelry box against her chest like a wounded bird. She had imagined this confrontation many times, but the reality, the cold light, the officer's pens scratching, her son's averted eyes, cut deeper than she had expected. Yet as she stood there, she also felt something new, the dignity of truth on her side. Each photograph, each note in James's pad was a small piece of her life being reclaimed. The living room of 1427 West Pine Street had never been so silent. Outside, a light drizzle began to patter against the windows, smudging the view of the neighborhood Martha had once known so well. Inside, the only sound was the faint squeak of Officer James Porter's pen as he filled out the official report. Samantha sat rigidly on the sofa, her arms folded like a barricade, her jaw clenched. Linda hovered near the kitchen doorway, wringing her hands. The twins whispered to each other on the stairs, sensing the tension but not understanding it. James cleared his throat and read slowly, his voice cutting through the stillness like a bell. "The suspects are being cited for forgery of legal documents and exploitation of an elderly person, pursuant to Missouri state statute." He looked up from the clipboard. "Do you understand these charges?" Michael Jenkins was standing by the window. At the words forgery and elderly exploitation, his body seemed to fold in on itself. He pressed his palms to his face as though trying to block out the room. His shoulders began to shake. The weight of weeks of deception, debt, and guilt seemed to crash down all at once. "Mother," he stammered, his voice muffled behind his hands. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I was drowning. The credit cards, the second mortgage, the business loan. I didn't know what else to do." Martha stood a few feet away, her coat still on, clutching her small notebook. She had prepared herself for this moment, she thought she had armored her heart. Yet seeing her only son, a man of 35, collapse like a child before her was like a knife twisting inside her chest. She exhaled slowly, the sound soft but steady. "Michael," she said quietly, "you could have come to me. You could have asked for help. I would have found a way." She paused, her eyes glistening. But you chose the cruelest way instead. Her words hung in the air. Michael lowered his hands, his eyes red, his face streaked with tears. He looked at his mother as if seeing her for the first time, not as an obstacle but as a person he had betrayed. Samantha, sitting on the sofa, clicked her tongue and leaned back, her voice sharp. Don't be weak, Michael. We still have options. We can fight this in court. You don't have to grovel. But Michael shook his head. He straightened up, his hands trembling but his eyes suddenly clear. No, Sam. No more. His voice cracked, but there was a finality to it. I don't want to keep doing this. This is wrong. Samantha's head snapped toward him. What are you saying? Don't you dare. I'm saying I'm done, Michael cut in, louder than before. I'm done lying. I'm done stealing from my own mother. For a moment the only sound was the rain outside and the quiet scratching of James's pen. Samantha's face hardened, but a flicker of panic crossed her eyes. The alliance she had carefully built was fracturing in real time. Martha felt a complicated ache rise in her chest, pain for what had been lost, but also a strange, small relief. Her son, at least, still had a shred of conscience left. She stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. Michael, she said, owning up is the first step. The rest is up to you. Michael looked down, nodding silently. Samantha shifted away from him on the sofa as though he were a stranger. In that living room, beneath the yellow glow of the old ceiling lamp Martha had picked out years ago, the balance of power had shifted. The facade of family unity cracked wide open, exposing the betrayal and the guilt beneath. And for the first time in weeks, Martha felt that maybe, just maybe, justice was finally beginning to take root. The paperwork moved faster than Martha had dared to hope. Rachel Coleman, her attorney, had been tireless, working late into the night drafting affidavits, collating photographs, and organizing the recordings. We're not just protecting your house, Rachel had said firmly across her polished oak desk. We're protecting you. By Friday afternoon, Rachel filed for an emergency restraining order that would bar Samantha Brown, Michael Jenkins, and Linda Brown from approaching Martha within 300 feet. It was approved in less than 24 hours. The speed shocked even Rachel. The evidence was overwhelming, she told Martha over the phone. Forgery, elder exploitation, and harassment, judges don't ignore that. Saturday morning dawned gray and cool. Martha woke early in the house she had built, her nerves tight like violin strings. She could smell coffee brewing in the kitchen, but it no longer came from Samantha's machine, it was her own old percolator, pulled back from the basement and polished until it shone. Outside, frost still clung to the edges of the lawn. The new security cameras Rachel had recommended blinked red at the corners of the porch, a quiet reassurance. At 9:10 a.m., a county process server in a brown jacket walked up the driveway with a manila envelope. He rang the doorbell and waited. Samantha opened the door a crack, her hair tied up messily, a sweatshirt hanging off one shoulder. When she saw the envelope, her expression soured. Mrs. Brown, the server asked. You've been served. Temporary restraining order, effective immediately. Samantha snatched the papers and scanned the bold print. Her face turned crimson. This is insane, she shouted, crumpling the notice in her fist and throwing it onto the damp lawn. That old woman will regret this. You hear me? The twins, half hidden behind the banister, stared down at the scene with wide eyes. Linda murmured something under her breath, tugging at Samantha's sleeve, but Samantha yanked her arm away. Michael, standing in the doorway, said nothing, his eyes were fixed on the papers on the ground. From inside the house, Martha stood behind the glass of the front window. She had locked the door early that morning, just in case. The cameras on the porch blinked steadily, recording everything. Her heart thudded as she watched Samantha's rage boil over on the lawn where she once planted daffodils. Rachel called just then. Martha pressed the phone to her ear, her hand trembling. It's done, Rachel said, her voice calm and warm. You've secured your home. They can't come near you now. Next step is to recover the property they took. Martha's knees went weak. She turned and sat slowly on the old oak chair by the hallway table, the same chair where she used to sit grading papers late at night. Her palm slid over the carved armrest, feeling the grooves worn by decades of use. For the first time in weeks, she let out a long, shaky breath. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of humiliation. They were lighter, freer, a release of weeks of fear and tension. She whispered to herself, "It's not over, but at least I'm safe now." Outside, Samantha continued shouting at the process server, but her words were muffled by the glass. Martha looked at her through the window and realized that the power dynamic had shifted completely. The woman who had sneered old Leech was now standing on the wrong side of the law, yelling into the wind. Martha wiped her cheeks, straightened her back, and reached for a pen to sign the next set of documents Rachel had sent over. Her hands still shook, but there was a steadiness underneath. For the first time since stepping off that bus from Florida, she felt like the house at 1427 West Pine Street was truly hers again, not just in the legal sense, but in spirit. 3 weeks later, the chill of early winter had settled over Springfield. The courthouse on Boonville Avenue in Greene County stood like a gray stone sentinel against the pale sky. Its steps were slick from melting frost, and clusters of reporters and curious locals had gathered outside, their breath-forming clouds in the cold air. A banner reading Courtroom 3B hung above the oak doors, and the buzz of whispered speculation drifted down the hallway. Inside, the room was hushed but heavy with tension. Rows of wooden benches creaked as people shifted to get a better view. A court artist sat near the front, sketching quickly. The soft click of camera shutters punctuated the silence until the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." Martha Jenkins rose slowly from the first row. Her hands clutched a small, worn handkerchief, embroidered daisies on one corner, a remnant of calmer times. She inhaled deeply, feeling her chest tighten as Samantha Brown, Linda Brown, and Michael Jenkins were led to the defense table. They looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by the harsh lighting and the rows of watching eyes. The prosecutor, a tall man named David Ellis, stood with a calm but unyielding expression. He began reading the indictment in a clear, resonant voice. Samantha Brown and Linda Brown are charged with fraudulent acquisition of property belonging to an elderly individual and forgery of legal documents. Michael Jenkins is charged as an accomplice. The words echoed off the paneled walls. Samantha shifted in her seat, her once confident posture slumping. Her lawyer, a sharp-suited man with rimless glasses, leaned close, whispering urgently. Linda dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her shoulders shaking. Michael kept his gaze on the polished wood of the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. David Ellis pressed a button on a small remote, and a flat-screen monitor flickered to life. Photos of the ransacked bedroom appeared, the pried-open jewelry box, the forged power of attorney, the handwritten note about selling the house. The room collectively inhaled. Next came audio clips, Samantha's own voice, calm and calculating, discussing a doctor who would sign off on Martha's memory loss. The defense lawyer stood and tried to object, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, these are taken out of context. My client was under stress." David Ellis cut him off gently but firmly. "These are her own words, sir. Context is clear." In the gallery, a local reporter from the Springfield News Leader scribbled furiously in a notepad. Another adjusted his camera lens to capture the defendants' faces. The case had already made headlines as a chilling example of elder exploitation, but seeing it unfold in real time was something else entirely. Samantha's jaw tightened. For once, she had nothing to say. Linda's sobs became audible. Michael swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper when asked to confirm basic facts. "Yes," he answered to one question. "Yes," again to another. Each word seemed to cost him a piece of himself. From her seat, Martha watched, her knuckles white around her handkerchief. She could feel her heart pounding, but she kept her face composed. She had told herself this wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. Still, seeing her own son at the defense table sent a pang through her chest that no victory could erase. Rachel Coleman, sitting beside her, placed a reassuring hand on Martha's arm. "You're doing the right thing," she whispered. Martha nodded faintly, eyes still fixed on the front. "I just never thought it would come to this," she murmured back. The judge, an older woman with silver hair swept into a bun, looked down over her glasses at the defendants. "These are serious charges," she said. "And the evidence presented here today is substantial." In that moment, the courtroom felt like a stage where every pretense had been stripped away. The family mask that Samantha had worn for years lay shattered. The son who had once called Martha his hero now sat trembling before the law. Martha straightened her back, clutching the handkerchief. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't dared hope for: closure. The day of sentencing arrived with a thin layer of snow on the courthouse steps. People shuffled inside, stamping their boots, brushing flakes off their shoulders. The courtroom itself was warmer but tense, filled with the low murmur of reporters and curious residents. The oak benches creaked as everyone settled. Martha Jenkins sat in the first row, her hands wrapped around her old embroidered handkerchief. Next to her, attorney Rachel Coleman flipped through a yellow legal pad one last time, her expression steady. At the front, the defendant sat quietly, Samantha Brown with her hair pulled back into a tight bun, her lips pressed together, Linda Brown clutching a tissue in her lap, and Michael Jenkins staring at his hands, his wedding ring glinting faintly under the overhead lights. For the first time since the ordeal began, they looked small, almost fragile, before the carved wooden bench of the judge. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Ellen Whitaker adjusted her glasses and began to read from the sentencing document in a calm but firm tone that carried through the entire chamber. In the matter of the state of Missouri versus Samantha Brown, Linda Brown, and Michael Jenkins. A hush fell. Samantha Brown, you are sentenced to 6 months suspended jail time, 200 hours of community service, and a fine of $15,000. Linda Brown, you are sentenced to 100 hours of community service. Michael Jenkins, you are sentenced to 100 hours of community service and ordered to return all assets and property taken from your mother. The words hung in the air like a bell tolling. Reporters scribbled furiously, a local TV camera light flickered on. Samantha's face went pale, she blinked rapidly but didn't speak. Linda's shoulders slumped as she began to cry softly, the tissue trembling in her hand. Michael's head bowed, and for a moment he looked like the boy Martha remembered from decades ago, contrite, lost, ashamed. Rachel leaned slightly toward Martha and whispered, "This isn't a victory, but it is justice. It's the system acknowledging what happened to you." Martha nodded slowly. Her eyes stayed on her son as she rose to speak. "I am not happy to see my son punished," she said, her voice steady but trembling at the edges. "But I could not stay silent. Silence would have been the real betrayal, to myself, to my husband's memory, to every hour I worked to build that house." Michael lifted his head, tears streaming down his face. "Mom," he choked, "I'm sorry. I thought I had no other choice." Martha stepped closer to the defense table, her shoes making soft thuds on the wooden floor. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "You still have choices," she said quietly, but firmly. "You still have a chance to make things right. Don't waste it." The judge watched silently, the gavel poised but still. The gallery was silent too, even the reporters holding back for a moment, sensing the gravity of the exchange. Martha squeezed Michael's shoulder once and then returned to her seat, sitting upright. Her handkerchief was damp but she held it tightly. For the first time in months, she felt a fragile thread of hope wind its way through the pain. As the session adjourned, Rachel gathered her files and glanced at her client. "You've reclaimed your home," she said softly. "Now you can reclaim your life." Martha gave a faint smile. "Yes," she murmured, looking at her son one last time before he was led out to sign the papers. "And maybe he can reclaim his, too." The courtroom emptied slowly, the echo of boots and whispers fading down the hallway. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world felt quieter, as if it, too, had exhaled. Winter in Springfield was already fading when the Jenkins case finally closed. A thin drizzle had replaced the snow, and the maples lining West Pine Street were bare, their branches scratching the sky like tired fingers. The old wooden house at 1427 stood quietly, its porch swept clean, new locks on the doors and a security camera blinking softly under the eaves. It no longer looked like a battlefield, but like a house catching its breath after a storm. Samantha Brown and her mother Linda left Springfield within a week of the sentencing. The neighbors whispered about them, shaking their heads when the moving truck came at dawn. Samantha kept her sunglasses on even though the sky was gray. She barked at the movers, careful with that box, but her voice lacked the edge it once had. Linda followed behind, a faded scarf around her head, avoiding the stairs. 2 small suitcases for the children sat on the curb. The twins clutched their stuffed animals, confused but quiet, watching their world change again. Michael didn't leave the city, but the big house was no longer his. He rented a small 1-bedroom apartment near the train tracks on the east side. The walls were thin and the radiator clanked at night. On his first evening there, he sat on the edge of the bed staring at a photo of himself at age 5, paint-smeared hands, standing next to Martha in front of the same house he had almost lost for her. Guilt felt like a stone in his chest. Every Saturday morning, Michael would show up at 1427 West Pine Street. He didn't ring the bell, he just walked quietly around back with his gardening gloves, trimming the hedges, pulling weeds, repairing the broken fence slat he had ignored for months. Sometimes he brought fresh bread from a local bakery. "I'm here to work on the yard, Mom," he would say softly at the door. Martha never refused him, but she also didn't rush to the porch like before. She would nod, "The tools are in the shed," and go back to her tea, letting him rebuild trust one chore at a time. Inside, the house was slowly returning to the way she remembered. She'd rehung her curtains, polished the wooden banister, and framed old photos again, this time in a locked cabinet. In the evenings she sat in her rocking chair with a journal, reflecting on what had happened. The rooms echoed less now, as if absorbing her calm. One afternoon, Martha met with Rachel Coleman in the living room. The lawyer's briefcase sat neatly on the coffee table. Papers lay stacked before them, the revised will and documents for a new charitable trust. "I've decided," Martha said, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "This house will not go to any family member. When I'm gone, it will belong to a foundation for retired teachers. A safe place, not a battlefield." Rachel smiled gently. "You've turned your pain into a lesson for others." "That's rare, Martha." Martha looked out the window at the maple tree she had planted 30 years ago. Its branches were bare now, but buds were already forming, tiny and green. "I just want this house to outlive the mistakes," she whispered. In that moment, the old house felt like it was exhaling with her, no longer a prison of betrayal but a sanctuary reborn, holding a story of survival and a promise for the future. It was a crisp autumn morning in Springfield. The sun was still low, casting long golden stripes across the wooden floor of the kitchen. The old clock above the stove ticked steadily, each sound echoing like a heartbeat in the quiet house. Martha Jenkins, now 68 but with eyes clearer than ever, poured water into the kettle and waited for it to boil. The smell of freshly ground coffee filled the room, earthy and warm, like a promise. She walked slowly to the window and pushed it open. A soft breeze slipped inside carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Outside, the maple tree she had planted decades ago blazed with red and orange leaves, its branches fluttering like flames against the blue sky. She paused, one hand resting on the windowsill, letting the sunlight touch her face. In the yard, Michael was bent over with a rake, pulling the leaves into neat piles. His movements were slower than before, more deliberate, as if each sweep of the rake was an apology. His breath fogged in the cool air. Finally he straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, and looked up toward the window. His voice was low but steady. "Mom. I know I was wrong. I'm going to start over." Martha held his gaze. For a moment she saw not the man at the defense table but the boy who once ran through these same piles of leaves, laughing. She gave a small nod. I only need you to be a good man, she replied gently. Michael swallowed hard, then bent back to work without another word. The rake made a soft shhh sound over the grass. From down the street came the sound of children's laughter, high, clear, untroubled. A group of neighbors' kids were chasing each other near the sidewalk, their voices carrying into the yard. The noise was so different from the chaos that had once filled her home, no shouting, no slammed doors, no accusations. Just ordinary life continuing. Martha turned from the window and carried her coffee into the living room. The rocking chair creaked as she sat down, cradling the mug in both hands. The steam rose like a small ghost before disappearing into the light. She looked around the room, at the polished banister, the framed photos, the worn rug she had scrubbed clean, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: safety. Her mind drifted back to the words Samantha had once hurled at her, old leech, words that had cut deeper than she had admitted. Now, sitting here in her own home, her head held high, she realized how wrong they had been. She was not a burden, she was the builder, the protector, the one who had stood up when it mattered. Outside, Michael continued to rake. A gust of wind scattered a few leaves, and he bent down, patiently gathering them again. For the first time, Martha believed he might truly change. She sipped her coffee slowly, savoring its warmth. 68 years old, a survivor of betrayal and courtrooms, she now sat free and independent, her dignity intact. The chapter of chaos had closed, a quieter, stronger chapter had begun. Through the open window the late autumn sunlight streamed in like a benediction, painting everything in a soft glow. It was a reminder and a warning all at once. Underestimating an older woman, her resolve, her patience, her will, had been the most costly mistake of all. And as the leaves fell silently in the yard, Martha felt at peace. Martha sat quietly in her rocking chair, the late autumn light bathing the room in a soft glow. Outside, Michael finished raking the last pile of leaves and looked up at the window. She raised her mug slightly in a silent acknowledgement, and for the first time in months there was no tension, only the sound of the wind and the distant laughter of children drifting through the street. The house at 1427 West Pine Street was no longer a battlefield. It had returned to being what it was always meant to be, a home. She thought back over the long road that had led here, the shock of betrayal, the sleepless nights in a cheap motel, the evidence she collected piece by piece, the day in court when the truth finally rose to the surface. She remembered her trembling hand on Michael's shoulder, her steady voice before the judge, the moment she chose not revenge but dignity. It had cost her tears and courage, but she had defended not just a house but her own worth. This story is not only about an older woman protecting her property, it is about resilience, about the quiet power of someone who refuses to be erased. Martha had been called names, dismissed as weak, yet she turned pain into action and reclaimed her life. Her journey shows that age does not mean helplessness, it can mean clarity, patience, and strength. And it shows that even when trust is broken, redemption is still possible for those willing to face their mistakes. If this story touched you, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need its message, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. Leave a comment below saying I'm listening so we can keep this conversation alive and stand together for dignity, family, and hope. Because at its heart, this is not just Martha's story, it's a mirror of so many quiet battles fought every day, often unseen, by people who simply want to live with respect and peace. May it remind us all to protect the vulnerable, to speak up when something is wrong, and to never underestimate the strength hidden in a gentle heart. See you in the next video.